What's your emergency?
3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the PIO Podcast, a place for all things public information related for police, fire, EMS, local, state, and federal government. An open forum to learn, grow, and develop your public information skills. My name is Robert Portavetti, and I am your host. I am a public information officer with over 17 years in the field and 27 years of law enforcement background. In each episode, we will explore different aspects of the public information officer profession. Weekly, we'll delve into the field of public information by talking to other PIOs. Welcome to Season 5. Thank you for your support of the podcast. I can't believe we're in our 5th season. So sit back and enjoy this episode.
Good afternoon. Today on the PIO Podcast, we'd like to welcome Doug Levy. He's from Doug Levy Communications. Doug, I'm so happy to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Doug, you were so kind to send me your book, The Golden Hour, Communications, The Golden Hour, and I read it cover to cover. My wife was yelling at me the other day that I tattered your pages, but I literally read it cover to cover, and very well done book. I know it's, I believe, a second edition. Excellent job, by the way. So this is what I want to talk about. But before we do that, I would like to know your background.
I've got a fairly complicated background, but I think that's what makes me reasonably good at what I do. I started out in journalism. I was a reporter for USA Today for most of the 1990s. I was a radio reporter before that. I've covered the federal government in Washington, D.C. I've covered stories literally from coast to coast. Everything from natural disasters and other emergencies to crime and fire. And while I was a reporter, I did some other things on the side. I became a volunteer firefighter, and really loved learning hands-on emergency response. That prepared me really well for fast forward a few years after I left journalism, when I was recruited to a position at the University of California, where in addition to being head of communications, the emergency management function was a big part of my role as well. And that's where I started working with law enforcement, because the University Police Department and I had to really collaborate. And this was in the early days of social media. So it was very complicated, very challenging for that police department to communicate effectively with a very diverse community that wasn't 25,000 people sitting in front of a computer screen. So we did a lot of experimenting and kind of figured out what worked, what didn't work. And I basically have been doing that kind of work ever since. I wound up in New York, where I ran the communications office at the Columbia University Medical Center. And in doing that, I wound up working with quite a few folks at NYPD and other emergency agencies. And in I love the small world department. I was invited to be a guest teacher at NYU for a class on using social media for emergency response. Well, fast forward a couple of years later, one of the people that was in that classroom wound up being head of communications, head of media relations for NYPD a few years later. So, things all connect.
Small world. Oh, yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's talk about the book. What inspired you to write The Communications Golden Hour, and how did your background really influence that writing?
Around 2015, I decided it was time for me to leave the rat race, basically. I'd been in a very high pressure job at Columbia, loved it, but it was time to do things that I was missing, which mostly was writing. And one of the things that I heard from my colleagues was that if there was any kind of a crisis or emergency, they wanted me in the room. For whatever reason, I'm one of those people that has the opposite reaction. When everybody else is going crazy, I'm able to just deal with it. And that's, you and I are cut from the same cloth. We're able to do things that others can't. And that's That's why diversity is such a good thing. At any rate, hearing that from so many people, I decided, well, I love writing. That's what I want to do. So I did my best to capture some of the lessons that I had learned into the first edition, which came out in 2018. It was 118 pages, a little bit smaller. That was geared very directly toward police and fire, especially because we had seen some very sad communications failures that in a number of instances contributed to loss of life and loss of property. And that's avoidable. So I guess the main thing is I wanted to write down the stuff that I wish somebody had taught me 30 years ago before the first time I had to go on camera. I have the video that I'm not going to let anybody see, but one of the first times that I was speaking on behalf of a fire department, no, you do not want to do what I did.
Trust me, I know the feeling. My very first time on camera was my second day in the position. We had a employee get robbed and stabbed. He was a civilian employee. He got robbed and stabbed on his way to the bank, and the bank receipts, our deposit to the bank was stolen. And, my interview was horrendous. And, later on afterwards, the reporter said, "I'm not even going to use your interview. I don't want to embarrass you." And he goes, "Just give me the basics. And I'm going to ask you a couple other questions. I'm going to make sure you get it right this time. So we do it right. Cause I got to have something for TV, but I don't want to put you on there." I said, "I appreciate that. It was my first time." And he goes, he says, "You should have told me. I would have told you what you needed to do." I'm like, nobody's told me anything yet. I hadn't even been to a class yet on how to be a PIO. I had just literally day 2.
Well, and what you just illustrated is a great example of why relationships are so important, because not every reporter would give you that grace, but that reporter recognized that the two of you were going to need to get along.
Yep. Yeah, and they did get the scoop on that whole incident a couple weeks later. So I did appreciate that. Doug, can you explain the concept of the actual golden hour in crisis communications and why it's so crucial?
When I trained as an EMT and firefighter, the trauma golden hour was drilled into us, especially because I was trained in Maryland, where the whole concept of shock trauma and rapid response and rapid transport to definitive care was developed. What happens in that first hour after major injuries determines whether the person's likely to survive or recover. In communications, we see the exact same thing. The initial communications and the initial response by the communications professionals dictates how the incident, at least from a communications and public reputation standpoint, will play out. These days, it's more like the communications 20 minutes because everything is accelerated. But what we have seen is that police departments and other emergency response agencies that get out quickly to let people know that they're on it are able to maintain that authority. In the absence of good initial communications, other people inevitably jump in. Many times well-intentioned, but rarely accurate. But whoever has the first information is more likely to have the media go to them. And in many cases, that's where residents and people who are at risk will turn, thinking that person is knowledgeable, maybe even knows more, or perhaps the authorities are holding stuff back that they know. And it's critically important that even if you don't have specific information, just letting people know that you're on it, you're responding, and that you're going to have an update, that alone makes a huge difference. And then after you get that initial message out within the first couple of minutes, you need to have a quick follow-up and at least one more, all within that first hour. If you do it that way, you maintain your authority, you maintain your credibility, you reassure the public, and especially if you need people to stay away or stay home, they're going to pay attention, and they're not going to be able to, they're going to be less likely to be swayed by others. And we've seen some great examples of this. The NYPD, it's a huge department. There's lots of good and some not so good. But one of the things that they've really, really gotten good at is that rapid, definitive information. I've seen them put out pretty solid statements about what's going on in 20 minutes. And they'll do a full-on briefing in less than 2 hours often.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, when Anthony Guglielmi was the communications director at CPD here in Chicago, he really redefined on how they communicated with the media and the public, to the point where he had a media car out that was out 24/7 that was driving to incidents. And then, it became standard practice that there was a 2-star deputy or the commander from the district that was speaking on behalf of that incident within an hour's time. So they've gotten really good, where before it was like ghost town. Good luck trying to find anything out.
Exactly. And CPD is a little bit different from a lot of the other departments. So I'm not sure that many departments are going to be able to have quite that level of response, but that, especially given the environment that he stepped into, that sounds like a really smart way to handle things. One of the other things that NYPD did that I think is a model that other departments absolutely can follow is the idea of decentralized communications. So you still have a central PIO operation, because you do have to have standards, and there's certainly a lot of things that need to be coming from the chief of the department. However, if it's an incident that happened in a precinct, why shouldn't the precinct commander be speaking? So NYPD has now implemented, I think we're almost into year 10, I believe, where NYPD trains every precinct commander on how to do briefings. Doesn't happen often, but it really does make a difference, especially because a good precinct commander is known to the community.
Right. Gives them that sense of reassurance and knowing that, hey, my district commander or my precinct commander, he knows what's going on, or she. Right.
And one of the things that I've seen NYPD do that I think is a very effective way to even reinforce that is they'll have the local commander or the next level up do the briefing, but somebody from headquarters will stand with them. Not do the briefing, but just be there.
Right. Shows them the full weight of the department behind that person. Yeah, absolutely. It's an effective way of communicating without actually saying anything. Okay, Doug. So how can PIOs, what are some of the common mistakes that PIOs make during their first hour of a crisis, and how can they be avoided?
A lot of it comes down to what happens between emergencies, the blue sky time. Because when there's an emergency underway, that's not the time to figure out who has to approve a message or who posts it to social media, who's got the passwords, who's going to be speaking on behalf of the department, where's the briefing going to be held. Those are all details that you're going to need to know under any circumstance. It doesn't matter what the emergency is. So after the alarm's going off, it's almost too late to figure those things out. You also need to know what are the resources you have. Because if it's a really big emergency, you're going to need to bring in extra help. Again, when you're into it, you don't really want to be searching around for that list of contact numbers. So mistakes often happen before the emergency begins. One of the other things that we've seen, and this one literally brings me to tears when I see it. When we have something, particularly if it's really bad violence, we're human. We have a natural instinct. We want to be reassuring. We want to be helpful. We want to help people stay calm. That's good. However, we also must be really careful with our words. And no matter what the situation is, in the first few minutes, you don't know what really happened. So, biggest rookie mistake is being definitive when you really don't know.
Yeah, you never want to walk back numbers or say that nobody died and there were clearly people that are dead.
Right. And Uvalde, Texas, unfortunately, in so many, from a tactical standpoint, of course, that was a disaster on that level. But from a communication standpoint, it also was literally the worst nightmare that those of us who have been working together over the years have ever had. We've always been afraid of it.
The school district comment that they put out to the parents saying that the children were safe and everybody was all right. And their comment when the report came out was, well, that's the way we've always done it. We've never had a problem. Wow.
Yeah, and that unfortunately was a perfect example of a small department that had not prepared for the possibility of a big incident. And the person that was responsible for communications was unaware of the principles of good communication. But number one thing is you don't say something that you don't know.
Yep, you're right. Doug, how can PIOs effectively balance the need for a rapid response with the necessity of accurate information? So this is kind of like what we were just talking about.
This is where having a PIO physically on the scene makes a big difference. Some of the not so good situations that we've seen, such as Minneapolis with the George Floyd incident, the PIO put out a statement based on what was reported by the officers who responded. And we later learned that what actually happened was entirely different. Really good PIOs either get to the scene themselves or insist on reviewing body cam footage or whatever is available before they'll say what happened. Before that, all you can say is what you know. Who was called? How many 911 calls came in? What were the callers reporting? What were the officers told when they were dispatched? What did the officers report when they arrived on the scene? Just lay out what is known while you're figuring out the details. And this is also where, as frustrating as it may be, it's very important to be clear. If it's an early statement, you can say, we just got here. We're figuring out what's going on. This is why we're investigating. When, we want to know, if you're asked a question like, how did this happen? We want to know that as much as anybody else. That's why we're doing an investigation. And when we have information we can share, we'll do that.
Right. There was just a shooting here in Doug here in Chicago yesterday. 8 people shot, 2 found dead. 1 died later on at the hospital. Within the hour, they had a 2-star deputy with the commander and the detective commander talking to the media. And the first thing that, the reporter's asking the question, do you know a motive? Well, we don't, we're still too early in the initial investigation to give that information yet. We don't have that yet. We're still investigating. And that was their comment on a lot of stuff couple of reporters actually got frustrated, but it was an hour into 8 people being shot with 2 known dead. I mean, there's not a whole lot you're going to be able to give out at that point.
And how many times have we seen incidents that appear to be one thing, and then when the investigation's conducted, you find out that it was really something very different? And, especially on things like motive, who was the aggressor, all that stuff. Those are details that don't have an immediate impact on public safety. And the consequences of reporting something that turns out to be wrong are pretty significant, both for the public safety and if there are people who are charged. What you say can have a big impact on the outcome of the trial. It might even interfere with the charges. So I think, one of the other sort of general mistakes that I've seen, and this is, I don't want to be stereotyping, however, I've tended to see this in smaller jurisdictions where the chiefs may not have had as much training, college, and so on. There is a very strong tendency to declare who's right, who's wrong, talk about the bad guys and so on. And police officers are not the judge or the jury. Police officers are fact finders, mostly. And you can report what you know, but how do you actually know who fired first if you weren't there at the time?
What role does social media play in modern crisis communications? And obviously PIOs are using it, but how should it be utilized effectively?
So I've spent a lot of time the last few weeks looking at media consumption data and how people get their news, because this has been changing over time, obviously. But if I go back over the last 30 years, it's completely changed. And in fact, in the last 5 years, the change has been more dramatic than I've ever seen before. Social media is the media. Social media in its many different forms is the primary way that people get information. The problem is that most people, many people, are not well equipped to distinguish between credible information and information that is dubious or perhaps deliberately wrong. And there's also a lot of information that is misinformation, but not because somebody's trying to spread wrong information. It's just, people have gotten confused about what's a fact. But that's our environment. That's how people get their information. The part that is frustrating is that before Twitter became X, Twitter had a system that at least helped distinguish between legitimate government agency accounts, for example, and everybody else. That system has disappeared, as well as changes with the algorithm, so that although Twitter remains one of the only places where we can publish information and people can access it without creating their own account, it no longer is a very effective way to rapidly disseminate authoritative information with the confidence that the news media, the legacy news media and others would be able to get it quickly.
And now, a word from our sponsors. Increase your social media reach and streamline your workflow with Social News Desk, the social media management software trusted by government agencies across the country. Publish effortlessly and securely across multiple social networks, including Nextdoor. Stay connected with social listening, engagement, and reporting tools all in one place. And here's an exclusive offer just for PIO podcast listeners. Get 3 months free when you sign up.
Head over to socialnewsdesk.com/PIO to get started today. And now back to our episode. Yeah, I never quite understood why they I know they wanted to verify accounts. I get that there was a way to create a money stream, but they should have come up with a way to show that an official account for an agency without having to pay for it was, come up with a gold check or something as opposed to the blue check.
So after a lot of us criticized the move, they did add a gray check, which
I have one of those. Yeah,
great. So that's most. I think it's you have to be a government person to have one of those. However, the blue checks no longer mean what they used to mean, and that's really the problem. We've been conditioned. A blue check means that's good information, but that's no longer the case. And it's very hard to compete.
No, it's just somebody's got a credit card, right? It's just a credit card.
At this point, that's exactly right.
Who pays a month? Yeah. Yeah. Who's got a credit card and a monthly fee? That's what it means. And it does not mean that they are legitimate. I mean, there are plenty of Russian, troll site accounts that are out there that are all verified.
Exactly. And, if you want to get into some of the ways that those operations work, that's a big part of what I work with clients on these days. But you asked about how we should be using social media. So, it used to be relatively simple. We could say Twitter, whether you like it or not, is the way to go for your main emergency channel. That's no longer a valid guidance, although in many instances it's the best we have, so it may be the right decision for some agencies. But there's a lot of other platforms. There's Blue Sky, there's Threads, there are people who put together big WhatsApp groups and so on. What's important is that each agency has to figure out where are the people they need to connect with. Personally, I feel very strongly that it's not okay for government information to require people to set up an account, or, especially if it's something they have to pay for. And we don't have a perfect solution for that. Blue Sky is emerging pretty rapidly as a possible alternative. Instagram Threads is promising, but you have to have an Instagram account. So, I mean, those are gates that keep people out. And we have to be really careful about that.
Blue Sky is kind of hard to navigate as well.
Especially because it's grown so quickly just in the last few weeks. But it's encouraging. But there were other platforms that came out that we tried, maybe used for a few weeks, and then they fizzled. There's a lot of variables here. So I think for PIOs, the thing to know is that it's going to constantly change. So what works today may not work tomorrow. What is absolutely important is that you must understand who your community is and how are you going to reach them. And it's not going to be, it's never been easy, but it's going to be harder than it was even 2 years ago. And maybe you do need to set up your own social media feed that's on your own website. That could work. But who in your community can access it? Are there people who don't have internet connections?
Right. What happens when the power goes out? I think of any of those incidents where we had wildfires out west in those communities. The electrical lines are gone. There's no internet. So I know they did the thing where they were in an intersection. They had a highway sign up there and people were handing out leaflets with information on it.
Yeah, sometimes that works. We had some very big fires in Napa County. This was now, I think, 2 years ago. The sheriff's department very quickly figured out they just needed to get a bunch of deputies going door to door. And they did. And that absolutely worked. Unfortunately, if they had done that in 2017, we might have saved some more lives. And I did an exercise yesterday with a group where part of the scenario was that the IT infrastructure was inaccessible. Now what? And, these are important things to be thinking about. But one of the easy mistakes that I've seen is thinking that, we've got a really good website or we've really got a great Facebook group, mistaking those facts from having effective communications. If you've got 3,000 people on your Facebook group, that's wonderful. But if the community has 75,000 people in it, how are you reaching everybody else?
Doug, can you share any examples of successful crisis communication strategies from your book?
There are many. The most important is getting good information out quickly and from somebody who is credible. I mentioned NYPD earlier. One of the examples that I do have in the book was of one of the many really, really sad, tragic shootings. This was one where I think there were 5 calls to 911 reporting a man who looked like he had a gun on the street. And there were multiple calls, so the dispatch went out as, priority 1. The initial responding officers were passing through the area. They were not from the local precinct. So they didn't recognize this man as a known individual with a mental illness who probably didn't have a weapon, but he was holding a piece of a pipe and it was holding it in a threatening way. So they did what well-trained officers do. They fired in self-defense because it looked like he was pointing a weapon at them. There's nothing in that scenario that's going to be good. However, it could have been a whole lot worse if the police hadn't done the communications as well as they did. In less than 2 hours, they had a full briefing. They had still images from video cameras from nearby businesses. So they were able to show from multiple angles what the officers saw when they arrived. And the individual was holding a metal piece of pipe, it turned out, in a threatening way. And nobody was praising, nobody was happy that an individual died. It was sad. It was tragic. And the briefing, I believe, was done by Chief Monahan, who, had a lot of credibility with the media because he was the person who usually did briefings on things like this. He was from headquarters, but he had definite information. He had, the time of the calls. What did the callers say? What did the dispatchers put out? Which officers responded? Who arrived? When did they arrive? What did they do? And what happened after shots were fired? They put the story to rest, basically. It was a tragedy, but it was, in some senses, unavoidable. But because they communicated so quickly and effectively, they avoided what could have happened, which would have been, the community was upset, completely reasonably.
Oh, absolutely. How could they
exactly
not be?
Including officers from the local precinct who knew this individual. If they had been the first to arrive, the outcome might have been different. But because the civilians who reported a man with the gun to 911, every available officer nearby responded, and this is what happened. By being so quick and definitive with what was established fact, they were able to mute the protests and other outrage that frequently occur in situations like that.
Right. Doug, how could PIOs prepare for those unexpected crises like the unusual high-profile incidents?
One of the things that I've taught, this is something that I learned the hard way, is you cannot plan for everything. And I really get frustrated when I see thick binders of templates, because templates play a role, but not as big a role as many of us used to think or used to be taught. You can't plan for everything. But if you have a solid plan for the things that you know must happen, you will be able to adapt when something happens that you hadn't thought about. The Boston Marathon bombing is a really good example of that. The hospitals obviously had a lot of people being brought in for treatment, some of them with very severe injuries. None of them had a tab in their binder for marathon bombing. But every one of the medical facilities had a plan for mass casualty incidents. You must be familiar enough with the plans that you've got so that you know where to go for the guidance. And if you're going to deviate from a plan, you really need to be thinking carefully, because the Boston Marathon bombing was a mass casualty incident. It had some nuances, but fundamentally, it was just like any other event where everybody was busy, the facilities were overwhelmed, nobody had time to do anything like talk to the media. That's why you do a plan.
Absolutely. Doug, do you have advice for PIOs working in smaller departments with limited resources?
Get to know your colleagues at other departments. The best examples of good communications in bad situations almost always include when somebody from a neighboring jurisdiction just shows up because they know you're going to need help. I remember when I had, again, I was a medical center communications person, and we had a mass casualty incident. It was a train wreck, and it looked like it was going to be bad. Turns out my facility was not going to be directly involved. I immediately called my counterpart at the facility that was receiving those cases and just said, I've got my whole team ready to go. Just tell us where you need us. And it turned out they didn't need us in that case, but just being available. And we had that level of trust because we had practiced responses that way. You can't meet your trusted colleagues during the incident, but if you've worked together, I mean, Highland Park, Illinois, the parade shooting is a perfect example of that. Chris Cavelli
is a really good friend of mine, and yeah, Chris, he just went.
Exactly. It wasn't his job technically, but the way that county, the way the Lake County law enforcement community worked together.
Yeah.
They knew each other. They trusted each other. When he showed up at the command post, they let him take on the role because they needed the help, and he was good at it. And he really was good at it because he understood who else was there to help too.
Absolutely. So, Doug, next question. How important is for PIOs to build relationships with the media before the crisis occurs, and how can they do that effectively?
This varies considerably from market to market, especially as the news media has changed a lot. However, whether we like it or not, the media still exists. the more you understand about who is behind those printing presses or that blog post or the social media site, the more familiar people are with you and the more familiar you are with them, the easier it's going to be when something bad happens. I was working with a county agency a few months ago where they had a lot of challenges with bloggers. And it turned out they were in a community where a number of people who had been laid off from major newspapers had set up their own publications, essentially. So these were experienced journalists trying to do good local reporting. In some cases, they weren't even trying to make money. They were just, they cared about the communities where they lived. Well, understanding that that was the motivation behind some of these bloggers was really important, because that's very different from some of the folks who now run newspapers. For example, in a community not far from where I live, one of my friends noticed that the local newspaper was not reporting on some kind of not good things happening with a major development that was being proposed. Turns out the developer bought the newspaper.
Huh.
As a PIO, you need to know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and again, the relationships are important, because the truth is most journalists and even most civilian, citizen bloggers, whatever you want to call them, they care about the community. They're not trying to do harm. They often are misinformed or misunderstand. If you get to know them, you at least have a shot at getting things right. When I first moved to New York, one of the reasons I was recruited to the job that I was in was that the medical center where I was working had been getting beaten up pretty badly by one of the major newspapers. So one of the first things I did was I called up the reporter that was writing all those bad stories, and I said, "Hey, I'm new. Let's meet for a cup of coffee." Turns out my predecessors had never done that.
Yeah, I always met with my reporters when I got into a new jurisdiction. I always had a meeting with them, or sat down with the news directors, sat down with the editors to talk about things, and just to kind of get to get them on track with the way I like to do things, and to find out what they're used to.
Another thing that you can do, and I'm sure you've done this, is that especially if you're in a major market where you've got some significant media outlets, invite the media to participate in some of your practice drills. Not every reporter is going to be willing to do that, but find a way to educate the media about what will happen in a big incident, so that they're not confused when something happens. And it's like, under what circumstances does another agency come in and take over the investigation?
Right. Absolutely. Doug, is there a question I should have asked? And if so, how would you have answered it?
Oh, that's a great question. I think probably one area that is worth putting a little bit of attention on is the importance of practice and preparation. We absolutely see the difference between somebody who has given at least a couple of minutes thought to what they're going to say versus somebody who just steps up to the camera. And that on-camera performance is more important than ever. The days of a handout piece of paper are long gone. People communicate visually now. So really understanding how to do that is very important. Whether you're doing it, at home with a webcam, or in a studio, or in the field with somebody else running the cameras, there's different ways to set up in each of those. There's different ways to react, and there is no replacement for practice.
I cannot agree more. Practice is very important. And the interesting thing about that is, law enforcement agencies and fire departments are really good about doing active shooter drills and rapid response deployment, that kind of stuff. Very rarely do I ever see agencies incorporate their PIOs into the whole scenario and do this. I was lucky enough to be part of an evaluation process for Cook County Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, where they had a virtual communication center set up, and it basically was every agency in the county was represented there, and they had a complete scenario set up where a tornado came through, went around 15 or 20 miles through multiple communities, and they had news stories that would pop up, and then you had to react to that. And those are the kinds of trainings that PIOs need.
Absolutely. The idea that a PIO would not be involved in SWAT team drills and so on just kind of boggles my mind, because the public information, there's a reason that FEMA puts the PIO at the top level of incident command. We play a strategic role in every respect. In many cases, we find things out before everybody else. And that's hugely important. I've seen so many incidents where the PIOs clearly are not in the loop, and that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing in any respect. It complicates things when you need to have everything buttoned up and nailed down in advance.
Right, absolutely. Doug, let's switch this up. Let's go to some rapid fire questions. You ready?
As ready as I'm going to be.
Texting or talking?
These days, texting.
Movies or books?
Books.
Coffee, tea, or energy drink?
All three, but I prefer tea.
Adult drink of choice?
Either a good glass of Pinot or a small shot of a good whiskey. Rarely, but...
What would be your super... I get it. Yep. What would be your superpower if you could have one?
Probably invisibility. I like...
Ask permission? Go ahead.
I like observing and learning from how other people handle situations, good or bad. And, being a fly on the wall would be
nice
great.
Feature, yeah. Nice. Ask permission or beg for forgiveness?
Usually beg for forgiveness. That's how I've gotten a lot of good things done.
It's a PIO way. What place do you most want to travel to?
Tough call. It's between Montreal or Japan, both great cities that I've been to many times and would love to spend more time in.
Excellent. What's your favorite way to relax after a long day?
Either listening to some good music like 1980s rock and roll or sitting down with a book.
If you could choose to have coffee with any historical figure, living or dead, who would it be?
I think Leonardo da Vinci.
That would be an interesting conversation. Yeah. Final thoughts here, Doug. What key points would you like our listeners to take from the interview?
As much as the media is changing and people's consumption habits change and our communities are changing and in some cases becoming more complicated and divided, PIOs play an integral role to making people's lives better. Getting information to people helps them make decisions for themselves based on facts. And personally, I don't think there is a more important role. If you embrace it and understand the potential impact and recognize that things are constantly changing, there's a lot of work to do, but we're in a great position to do it.
I agree. As we wrap this up, is there a piece of wisdom or a motto that you live by?
Something that works every time is put yourself in the shoes of the people you're speaking to. What would you want to hear if you were in their position?
Excellent. Doug, if people wanted to get your book, The Communications Golden Hour, where can they get it?
It's available on order from virtually any bookstore in the United States, or from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, online, or they can come to publicsafetypress.com and, or actually my own website, douglevy.com, and order it any of those ways.
And I'll put some of that into the show notes so everybody can find it. Doug, how can people best reach out to you to connect or follow up, or maybe engage your services if they need
on my website, douglevy.com? I've got a couple of clips from some of the workshops I've been doing recently on using AI, especially to fight misinformation, how to develop key messages. I love doing media training. I'm a ham and I like helping other people do even better. So douglevy.com is a good place to find me.
Doug, thank you very much for being on the show. What a great interview today. You gave us a wealth of information. I know I kept you a little long, but I truly appreciate you doing this interview. Thank you for this podcast. I've learned so much over the years from listening to the other guests you've had. And, again, one of the great things about the PIO community is that we really like sharing what we've learned so that others do even better. I completely agree. And that's one of the reasons why I created the podcast, was to connect with everybody and learn more. Thanks. Doug, thank you for being on the show. I hope you enjoyed this episode and our content. If you are listening on a platform that allows reviews, please give us a review. We read all reviews and your feedback is essential. Do not forget to check out our sponsor, Social News Desk. Thank you, Social News Desk, for their sponsorship and their offer to all our listeners. Please click the link at the bottom of today's show notes to help support the show. Your support in any amount is greatly appreciated. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep the conversation going. You're the heart and soul of the PIO podcast.